Welcome back to my YouTube channel, everybody. Today, my guest is Katherine Schweit, who's a former FBI special agent. And today with Katherine, we'll talk about the recent shooting of two Israeli embassy staffers in Washington, D.C., close to the Jewish Museum. Thanks for your time, Katherine. Thanks for joining me today.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Well, Katherine, before we start discussing this case, would you like to give my viewers some background about who you are, whatever you feel is relevant about your career to discuss this case?
Oh, sure. I'm happy to. As you said, I'm a former special agent. I was a FBI agent for 20 years in the FBI. Before that, I was a prosecutor in Chicago. So, born and raised here in the States, and worked in the court systems as a prosecutor. Some places they call them district attorneys. I was a prosecutor, and then joined the FBI. 20 years in the FBI, but my last 5 years in the FBI, I became the point person for the FBI on these types of shootings. We call them active shooters, where a shooter comes into the scene, specific purpose to kill somebody in a public place, and oftentimes we see other people, innocent, non-victim, not intended victims killed in those situations, but also things like what you hear about internationally, school shootings and movie theater shootings and shootings at parks and concerts. Those are active shooter situations, and I'm an expert in that area. I created the FBI's program for that and then ran it for 5 years. Then when I left the FBI, because I hit the retirement time that I was supposed to retire, then I retained that and it maintained, and that's all I pretty much do right now from a consulting standpoint, is consult with companies and schools about how to protect themselves. So when the shooting occurred here in Washington, D.C., which I live right outside of Washington, D.C., this was something that was right on point with what I usually work on and actually get asked about.
So what happened in this case is that we have this guy from Chicago who approached the Israeli Jewish Museum, and he shot two of the embassy staffers right outside the museum. And after shooting them once, when they were already on the ground, he got closer and shot them again multiple times. Is it terrorism or just a hate crime? What do you think?
Yeah, I think that the challenge that we have with terrorism is in the United States, terrorism is actually a criminal offense. And we have certain types of terrorism and not certain types of terrorism. Like if you came from a foreign country and a foreign country directed you to commit a violent act here in the United States, we would call that international terrorism. But there isn't a domestic terrorism charge in the federal system. There is in the states, some states, but there isn't in the federal system. So the way that these crimes and the way that the FBI, this would be an FBI investigation, the way, in addition to the police in the District of Columbia, Washington, D.C., the way that we would investigate it would be more on the hate crimes. Certainly murder, right, or attempted murder, those charges can be state or federal, but hate crimes is part of the way. Gun offenses, hate crimes, those are the types of charges that this individual is charged with, will be charged with. But we don't have a domestic terrorism. And I say domestic because he went from Chicago to Washington, D.C., which is about a 15-hour car drive. So he drove 15 hours or came in that distance to get here. But there isn't a domestic terrorism federal charge that he could be charged with. Is it an act of terrorism? It is certainly under the definition of the word terrorism. When you go for political purposes or social purposes to commit a violent act and to create fear in the environment, that is considered a terrorist act, but there isn't a criminal charge for that, if that makes sense.
It does, yes. But so this happened when it was night in Italy. So I woke up the day after and I heard this on the news. And before the announcer said it all, I was expecting another Luigi Mangione case because I was expecting the shooter to flee. In this case, something totally different happened because it didn't even try to escape or to flee. It just went into the museum, sat down, and waited for
Right.
the police to come over so that he could yell in front of TV cameras, I did it for Palestine, I did it for Gaza. What does
Right.
this tell us about his motives and also his personal features as an attacker?
Yeah, so I love that you asked that question because a lot of when something bad happens, a lot of people want to know, okay, well, why did this person do this, and how come he didn't do that? A lot of times we watch television and movies, and we see, the bad guy run in, he commits his violent act, and then he runs away or he drives away, gets in his getaway car with his buddy. In these kinds of shootings, we don't generally see that. Most all of the individuals who commit this kind of violent act, what we would call an active shooter, they commit that kind of act on their own. They may be inspired to do it. There are three things that we think about in terms of terrorism. When we think about, is this a terrorist act? There may or may not be, as I mentioned, a criminal charge that you can actually charge them with terrorism. But when we think about terrorism, we think about, is a country is another foreign actor asking somebody directing them to commit a terrorist act in the United States. That's where we could get an international terrorism charge. Is the person, or there's a second one, is the person inspired by a terrorist group? So we certainly have terrorist groups that in the United States, we have Hezbollah as an example as a designated terrorist organization. If you follow Hezbollah and you believe in what they're doing, but someone in Hezbollah doesn't direct you to do it, then we say that that's an inspired terrorism act. You are inspired by your following of them to do that. Then the third is what we see kind of most often, which is more of a lone actor, an individual who isn't being directed by a foreign terrorist group, or another, who isn't inspired because they're part of their group and they act on their own. But in fact, this third type is just really the term that you hear oftentimes, lone wolf or a lone actor. What we mean by that, not necessarily is that they acted alone, although almost all the time they do, but what we mean is they're acting on their own. No one is directing them. Nobody is saying kind of go do this. I think what we saw in this instance in Washington, D.C. is kind of a hybrid of that, because there have been since of all of what occurred in Gaza and in Israel in October last, there has been such tumult and so many protests in the United States, and there has been a lot of calls for violence, just in general on social media and bloggers, YouTubers, in regular traditional news media. There have been people who have saying this what's happening in Gaza and Palestine, as an example, is a terrible thing, and Israelis should pay for that, or Jews should pay for that. And because there's so much of this foment of hate and anger, even people who maybe might not have thought they had ever thought about following a terrorist organization or doing something like this, now we're seeing outward signs of people who are protesting even in public in support, for instance, of Hezbollah or Hamas, which is something that is very, very unusual. I work Hamas cases as an FBI agent, and I never saw anybody out there on the protest line saying, go Hamas. Now, sometimes we see that. It's very rare, but we see it. But it also speaks to the fact that if somebody will come out in public and do it, they're going to be doing it online. And that's what we're seeing. What we saw in this case is somebody who decided he needed to do that. In his writings in the initial early investigations tell us that he feels like this was something he needed to do, which he maybe never would have done before.
And in this case, we also have an homegrown attacker. In Italy, we're already seeing terrorists who are born and raised, well, not in Italy, sorry, in Europe, in France and Belgium and Germany, for instance, who were born and raised in Europe, second generation or third generations. In Italy, not
Right.
yet, but of course, it will. I see that coming sooner or later. Is it shifting the paradigm of the investigation? Because in this case, we have an American Islamic terrorist, which has nothing to do with Tim McVeigh or that kind of terrorism.
Yeah.
It's a new system. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's a great thing to bring up. If looking from the outside, metaphorically, in addition to actually, since you're from out of the United States, but even metaphorically, what we've had in this kind of when we look at people who are committing this kind of violence, terrorizing neighborhoods or terrorizing communities or groups of people and things like that, generally that kind of violence in the United States has come primarily, not exclusively, but primarily from the right, white supremacy, white supremacists who we had an attack at a grocery store in Buffalo, New York. 10 people, I believe, were killed. And that person who committed that act drove from wherever he lived to that location where the grocery was, knowing that the people who would be in that store and out in the parking lot were Black. We had an attack in a synagogue in Pittsburgh, and there were many people killed there. White supremacists, though, who were doing that. So what's different about this attack is, though we have many of the kind of right-leaning white supremacist attacks that have resulted in deaths, what's different about this one is we have very few left-leaning, and this would be considered a left-leaning attacker, and that is very unusual. Although there have been a lot of left-wing, so to speak, acts of violence in the United States since the October attack, a huge uptick in terms of broken windows and broken car windows and vandalism and spray paints and that kind of thing, but not deaths, not attacks that result in deaths. So this is really a huge difference, and it really has upped the stakes in the United States, that we're not just trying to prevent right-wing attackers who might have political or religious ideological views, but now left-wing attackers who primarily were kind of protesters in the United States. They're the ones that we see out in droves, in thousands in every city, protesting, but not really committing violent acts unless it's kind of the simple violent act of incident to the, I mean, it's not that there's no violence on the left, but certainly not like this. I mean, we have right wing, we have people driving cars through parades. Left wing, we've broken windows and storefronts and things like that. So this is a big change for us to see a domestic action like this. And depending on the state where it occurs, there are many states that have domestic terrorism statutes that they passed after 9/11. I'm from the state of Michigan originally, and the state of Michigan, the legislators there passed a domestic terrorist act after 9/11, after the 9/11 attacks, when the planes and towers were hit here in Washington, New York, and Pennsylvania. We had 4 jumbo jets that on the attacks in 9/11, 2001. Some states passed those, and so Michigan has one, for instance. And when there was a shooter in a high school in Michigan, that shooter was charged with a domestic terrorism charge and went to jail for life for it.
Well, and the day after the attack, the FBI searched this guy's house in Chicago. What do you think can come from that raid? Anything important about his background or his foreign connections? What do you think can come out of that?
It's very important that one of the first things that we do is determine where the person was living. In an investigation, we go backwards. You start from, we found this person in Washington, D.C., and you mentioned that he kind of gave himself up. That's not unusual. And I think the reason that they do that is because they want to continue their story. They come in with a purposeful story, and he wants to continue his story by being able to yell at law enforcement and at the media as he's being carried away. But then also, every time there's a trial, every time there's a court hearing, he's going to find ways to have his voice heard. And there are people who maybe are sympathetic to him who will do the same thing. So when you talk about doing a search, the first thing that we want to look for, we're going to simultaneously search his car and his person and his home. We're going to get court orders to do all those things. His place of business, he has one. We're going to do electronic searches on his phones, his computer, And we're going to do kind of a forensic deep dive into where has this guy been? What trails has he left around online to see first, is he acting with other people and is there another threat? This may be the first attack, right? When the first plane went in New York City, the first plane went in to the tower, we wondered, was that an accident? But I was standing in my office with my staff of terrorism agents in Milwaukee at the time, Milwaukee, Wisconsin. We saw the second plane went in. We knew it was a terrorist act. We knew it was a terrorist act at that point. But right now, when first thing happens, first thing you want to do is be sure that this person was not acting with others and there's not a subsequent act. So that's why you get a search warrant right away on his car, his home, things like that. Then you do a next step, which is to find out, what inspired him to do this? Who, did anybody support him, provide him weapons, provide him ammunition, money to travel? Sometimes that tells us that there's a conspirator, right, involved in it. But then what we're really concerned about is the writings that he has done. Nobody does this on a cold call. All of these types of shootings, I'll tell you as an expert in this area, all these types of shootings are done with long planning. There will be a long list of what he did, when he did it. His whole search history will tell us how he learned to do it, how he learned what weapons he needed, how to travel there, how to stay out of sight until he could do it. He learns from other people, other actions, like the CEO shooting in New York City. Mangione's the shooter there, who's on trial much in the same way, assassinates somebody on the city streets. And so we're looking to build a case. Law enforcement would look to build a case with prosecutors to explain why he did it, and and a lot of that really kind of builds to what kind of punishment should he get if he's found guilty.
Well, you already mentioned, and I would like you to elaborate, that there might be, in cases like this, foreign connections. Because, for instance, we know that we switched from the Al-Qaeda schema, that is, come to Afghanistan and train with us, to the ISIS
Right.
schema, that is, will radicalize you via the internet. In this case, probably we have a third schema, that is, this guy radicalized himself without any foreign connections. What do you think? Is that an option, or maybe they'll find out that he was somehow connected to somebody in the Middle East?
Yeah, I love that you bring that up, because I think that it's really important from a prevention standpoint for everybody to recognize that is what's happening. It's not directed by a foreign terrorist group. It might be inspired if they're working with somebody, but more than likely it is just what you said. He radicalized himself, and we would call that lone actor. He radicalized himself. It is essential that we know, if I was a betting person, I would not bet on the fact that somebody directed him to do this particular act. But there's probably plenty in his own writings, in his search histories, and the people he coordinates with, and the chat rooms that he's in, what he watches on YouTube, to show that he's listening to people who are saying, in order for our voices to be heard, we need to act further. You need to go out there and do your part. And I think that's part of what he has said in some of his writings that they've seen, and we've seen it in others. So the writings that they're beginning to see say things like, I read that I need to be part of the solution. I mean, I'm kind of putting silly words down, but just to explain that, and I need to do my part. So he's reading things and writing things and seeing people saying, everybody needs to do their part. If you're outraged by this, if you believe in that, then you need to go out there on your own and you need to do this. And then he looks for ways to do this, whatever that violent act is. How and why he chose to come into Washington, D.C., that is probably one of the most intriguing things that we would want to look for. Why he chose these two people who were killed were young employees at the Israeli embassy, but they were killed outside the Jewish Museum, which is 3 miles away in Washington, D.C. That's a pretty good distance. So I don't do kilometers to miles very well, but 3 miles is about
4.5. 4.5.
Yeah, a little bit more. I'm trying to think of, if it's 3 miles, right? It's almost like, it's like almost 5 kilometers, right?
Yeah.
So 4.5. So So definitely he made a decision to go to that location. He knew there was an event going on there. They had not, had any particular violent concerns or acts. Not that they didn't have security or like we've had at the Israeli embassy, but this escalation that we've seen of these kind of acts, like you were saying, I think these are individuals who are inspired on their own, and feeling like they need to be part of the solution because they're hearing the general information about they need to be part of the solution.
Well, another thing that I find surprising is that the day after the attack, I already saw on social media people showing appreciation for this person exactly the same way as happened with Luigi Mangione a few months ago. Okay, people are crazy. And of course, if you look on a big amount of people as you have on social media, you're going to find the craziest people ever and everywhere in the world. But were you expecting something like this?
Well, having worked Hamas and Hezbollah cases as an agent, um, I was um, I was a little taken aback that there would be so many people publicly, right? And I think part of that is right, that there are more people available, right? And I think there's also a lot of uh, online bravery. Everybody's brave online when they can hide behind their computer. I mean, I think that we're probably all guilty of that in certain ways, right? We'll send an email that might be too harsh because we can, or we'll say something online in an interview because we can get away with it because we're in the safety of our own home. So I think we have had a lot more people who are more confident in their ability to have that, computer bravery and stand behind their keyboard bravery, right? And stand behind their keyboard and say it. But the fact that I guess I respect. I mean, I'm a big supporter of our U.S. Constitution, which allows for political speech to be absolute freedom of speech. And I know that not every country is that way. Um, but but the difference as an FBI agent is that political speech that foments violence is not tolerated, and it shouldn't be tolerated. So I'm surprised that there would be people who would say they support it, and I would say that probably one more bit about that, like the throwback that would be that in the United States, we're a very young country, and the young kids in their 20s who started our country in the 1700s, who were all very young, Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton, they would all be considered traitors today, right? From a
Yeah.
political standpoint. So they violated laws and rules and committed, what would be called terrorist acts today. So I think that's the challenge, is that I think that the mentality of people who are supporting somebody like Mangione, who was the shooter up in New York, who killed a CEO of the in a healthcare company, um, supporting this shooter from Washington, D.C., who kills two young Israeli embassy workers. They all have their reason why they're doing it. It's just personal attacks and violence against individuals. I can't get my hands around how you could justify that, as opposed to all the other things that we could do from a political standpoint if we disagreed with what was going on.
Yeah, absolutely. So how bad is anti-Semitism in the United States right now? Is it coming back?
It is. And sadly, I think we've had a very sad stretch. Certainly, the incident in October, the October attacks escalated it, right? And they've been like fivefold. And most of it has been, as I mentioned, the kind of violence that is from a prosecutor's standpoint, we call nuisance violence, right? Windows broken and spray paint and cars that are bashed, the windows are bashed in. So a lot of vandalism, but not necessarily a lot of violence that includes physical attacks. But have the physical attacks risen in the United States? Absolutely. We have, we're 3, 4, 5 times higher than we were 10 years ago. And there's a really acceptance of anti-Semitism, which is almost kind of hard for me to even appreciate how that could be, that because I don't, because of I work in such a, I've always worked in such a tight area. It's hard for me to understand why an entire population could, how you could feel a particular way about an entire population.
Well, I can tell you how it works in Italy. I mean, right-wing extremists hate everybody just because they're
Yeah,
different.
right, exactly. Same with us, right wing, exactly. And most of ours are white supremacists, right? So they hate everybody except for whites, whatever that means. And but then on the left, that we're seeing there definitely we've always had the anti-Semitism from the right. It's less common to see it from the left, especially in violence and in this way, this type of violence, this level of violence.
Well, since you also have experience as a prosecutor, I would like to ask you, how easy is it gonna be to build a case against this Rodriguez guy? Because I think it's gonna be very easy because he shot two people and then he sat down waiting for the police, and there are eyewitnesses seeing him, and he also
Yeah,
confessed the crime. What do you think?
yeah, yeah. I mean, it's not a question of convicting him. I think it's very important to go through the process. You have to go through the steps. I'm very firm in that as a prosecutor. You don't just say, okay, well, he's guilty or he said he's guilty. You have to prove the evidence. You don't know what the circumstances are. You have to gather all the evidence, the fingerprints on the guns, and where did he buy the weapons, and how did he get his ammunition, and how did he get into town. So, will they build a case that's airtight? Absolutely, they will. I'm pretty confident of that. Even when somebody, even in our court systems, even if you came to me and said you killed somebody as a court officer, that's not enough for us. We have to build a case that goes beyond somebody even admitting that they did something. So even a confession is not enough to put somebody in jail here. But we can build the case, and I think that very quickly they'll be able to build the case. I mean, say quickly, it takes time. People want like somebody charged. They charge this guy right away, but they might charge other charges. They want to. You only charge somebody. You only get a chance to, you know, for a trial one time, right? So you want to make sure that you have all of it. And I think that from a politics standpoint, sometimes we see individuals who, even though they are clearly guilty of the conduct, they won't accept, for instance, a plea agreement. They won't accept a sentence. When you kill people in the United States, you can get sentenced to the death penalty, right? I mean, it depends on what state and what place you're charging them. In some states, they allow the death penalty. Federal, they allow the death penalty in some circumstances. So you might plead and accept a plea of life in jail with no chance of being executed or some things like that. Some people, if they're committing a crime that's, I would say, politically motivated, is what I'm going to use that term, politically motivated, like this crime, they may not want to accept a plea because they want to go to trial. They want their case heard in court. They want the headlines because it's important to them to be important and to have their say. So I think that the case will absolutely come to fruition. It's possible that he will eventually plead guilty, but it will take some time to do that because they'll have to put the case together. They'll have to offer him, instead of trial, if you accept this plea agreement, you'll get this. And I think that idea of accept this plea agreement, the people who are impacted, the victims' families, they may not want a plea agreement. You know, they may want a death penalty, right? So the prosecutor's office has to have those discussions, not only with the defendant's attorney, but also with the victims' survivor families.
Well, Catherine, many thanks for your time. I think that you broke down the case very well for us, and I think that everyone who has watched this video has a much clearer view on what happened and what will happen in the near future about this case. So thanks again for your time.
My pleasure. Anytime. I'm happy to help explain things. I hope it helped a little bit, and I think you asked me great questions. So many times I don't get great questions asked, so I really appreciate you doing that.
Thank you. So thank you also for your appreciation. And so I look forward to having you on the channel again to talk about maybe the
Yes,
evolution of this case or maybe about
absolutely.
something else.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. You have a safe day.
Thanks everybody else for watching this, and see you all in my next episode. Bye bye.
Yeah, and I'll see you too.